Hey there, welcome to This Week in Social Media. I'm Rob Tersick, and this week we are taking a look at the phenomenon of people power, how social media can actually move people to great action. And our guest this week is a documentary filmmaker named Velcrow Ripper. So stay tuned, this is going to be a great show. Hi there, welcome back to This Week in Social Media. We're taking a look at people power today, and I've got a terrific guest who will be coming on shortly from New York, a documentary filmmaker named Velcrow Ripper. But to get started here today, I want to take a look at a couple of headlines, because this is a big week in social media. The first story here on my computer screen is that YouTube has announced some new statistics, quite astonishing, that show the rapid growth of social media here. YouTube, about 8 months ago, let the world know that they were getting 48 hours of video uploaded every hour. And now that's increased. They're now getting an hour of video uploaded every minute. So every minute of the day, 60 hours of video an hour are being uploaded to YouTube. This is an extraordinarily rapid growth rate. You've heard about exponential growth. You've heard about this incredible progress. This just shows you how fast it's growing. To put that in perspective, in a single month, YouTube is getting about as much video uploaded to its site as all 3 major broadcast networks in the United States have aired since they launched their services in the 1940s. So it's really quite amazing, this sea of social media that is growing rapidly around us. And it just shows you the power of this particular platform. So that's a great, interesting stat for us coming from YouTube. And an interesting tale this week from Mashable. They picked up this story. Your Google information is worth up to $50,000 a year. Reputation.com offered that estimate. They said it was ranging from $50 to $5,000 a year to marketers. So that's how much your info is valuable. You know, you notice this when you're using products on the internet that are free. You know that you're kind of being tracked. Everybody's dimly aware of that. We know that those services aren't really free. We're actually the product. And what they're doing is tracking what we do, and then they package that up in a useful way for marketers, who then tailor their services to our whims and to our needs and our interests. It turns out that there's quite a lot of money there. So the business of social media and the business of sharing your personal interests and likes on the web turns out to be quite a lucrative field. And they are not the only company that is mining your data in this fashion. One more story that just came out. The FBI, it turns out, has issued a request for proposal to software developers to build a monitoring tool for social media. Now, this might fall in the category of information that really isn't news to those who've been tracking the federal government and various police forces' use and monitoring of social media. This happens on a worldwide basis. Law enforcement officials have routinely requested information from social media sites. Usually it's related to a single case, and it might require a subpoena. Here we have something new as a development. That is that the FBI is now going to publicly and officially begin to monitor certain keywords. As you can imagine, these keywords are related to terrorism. Of course, there's been an outcry from civil liberties groups who feel that it's A, not going to be very effective, and B, that it's a massive intrusion for the government to be listening in on our conversations. We'll keep monitoring this story here at This Week in Social Media. But the story that I want to talk to you about today is really more about what happens when people begin to use these tools to agitate for social change, for political change. And let's roll a clip right now from our guest.
This film, I started going to other Occupies. The first one I went to was Occupy Oakland. And I went there for the general strike. And it was the day that we marched to the port with like 40,000 people, and we shut down the port. A really powerful, beautiful experience for me.
So Velcrow Ripper, a New York-based documentary filmmaker. He is the creator of dozens of very successful films. In Canada, his films have been award-winning. They've been recognized. 2 of the film titles that you should keep an eye out for. One is called Scared Sacred, and his most recent film is called Fierce Light, When Spirit Meets Action. Welcome to the show, Velcrow Ripper.
Here.
Tell me, first of all, everyone's going to want to know about your name. Is that a real name, Velcrow Ripper?
It's real to me. It was a name that I got when I was 19, a few years back, and I used to be a punk rocker, and I was actually at a rainbow gathering. I was the only hippie, and they couldn't get their head around it, so somebody nicknamed me Velcrow, and it stuck.
Right on. So that is your real name, and you are now making documentary films, and you've been tracking the Occupy movement since its inception. When was the first time?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was here, on the first day, and actually I was tracking this movement before its inception because I was doing this feature documentary that looked at the emergence of social movements around the world, what Paul Hawkins calls the largest mass movement in history that didn't even know it existed. So in some ways, Occupy was that movement discovering itself.
Right on. Yeah, we've been covering the story here from time to time ever since the Occupy movement got started. And the phrase we've been using is autonomous, leaderless, self-organizing movements. You know, they're not necessarily political parties. They don't really have a platform per se. And they don't really have the kind of charismatic leadership that you would expect a party to have. Instead, they have a radically different approach. Tell me a little bit about that, your experience of it.
Sure. I mean, this is the form of organizing that launched the Arab Spring, is what we saw with the Indignado movement, the European summer. It goes way back to Argentina, and it's actually a naturally arising phenomena. It's horizontal power, and in fact, one of the things that it's really about is challenging the pyramidal shape power that we have right now, what they're calling the 1%, this tiny percentage that's accumulating the wealth, and looking for new ways of sharing not only resources, but also sharing our personal power too, coming together in a collaborative way, very much like the open source movement, very similar to that. And that's one of the reasons it's so in sync with the way social media works.
We're starting to hear that more frequently now. We're starting to hear phrases like open source politics. We're starting to hear about social media lobbying as a new concept. And I think in some ways, the Occupy movement was an expression of that. But that's not how big media saw it. Certainly in September of last year, they had a very different stance. Tell me about that experience.
Sure. I mean, the sense was, when I was filming, I was posting a lot on Facebook, and people, and I have a large number of followers and now subscribers, and people were kind of surprised they weren't hearing about it because this was obviously something culturally significant. Yeah. In effect, there was like a media blackout. And why that is, the speculations were that the mainstream media is owned by those same corporations which were being called to task by the movement. That's a possibility. It wasn't until people started getting arrested in large numbers, when the 700 people were arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge, that really the story broke, because it was international news. It was being covered everywhere else but in the actual United States itself.
Now, right now we're looking at some footage from your documentary, which you have the working title for that, right? The documentary that you're making. Yeah,
it's called Occupy Love. And we're planning to have it in movie theaters and then and out into the world by the fall of 2012.
And what's the premise of the film? What's the through line on it?
It's really looking at the fact that there is this global movement of movements emerging around the world that is looking to create a new world, a world that works for all life, a world that's based on compassion and justice instead of hypocrisy and greed, which is now the name of the game.
Wow, well, that's a pretty bold stance. We'll probably want to come back and revisit that comment in a bit. But what I wanted to do here was take us back in time a little bit to one of the social media clips that actually sparked this. Now, you could name a different time. Many people have different views about when this process began. Some people point to 2009 in Tehran. There were a couple of clips that came from those demonstrations, what they call the Green Revolution, when a presidential election was contested by people there in the streets, and they were using Twitter quite a lot. CNN and BBC were not able to cover it, and social media turned out to be the only way to get a story out of Iran at that time. So that was a couple years earlier. But last fall, I should say 2010 in the fall, we started to see something happening in North Africa, particularly in Tunisia and in Egypt. And it was this video clip that actually began and triggered a huge movement in Tahrir Square. Let's take a look at Asma Mafez's video clip. Really a call to action. And so this was a call for people to gather in the square. In the clip, she says that this is the beginning of the end. She actually foresees that if enough people show up on Tahrir Square, that people power can shift the government. This is one YouTube video that really changed the government. What's your take?
Yeah. Well, the video went totally viral, and she also, she went down by herself with just a few people to Tahrir Square. No, they were beaten. No one showed up, and she kind of kept sending these videos out and really calling calling on the pride of the people to say, look, I'm a woman here, a girl actually going out by myself. Are you going to let me do this? And on January 25th, there were other people putting out calls on Facebook as well, including a Google executive, which helped a lot. Together, they managed to mass ultimately millions of people, and they toppled a dictatorship.
It's quite an extraordinary tale, and in terms of the power of media, it's probably one of the most concise examples of what can happen when people have democratic access, free access to publish and distribute their own perspectives. We see a lot of garbage published on the web, but occasionally one clip will resonate with people because it speaks to a truth that really, many, many people can identify with, and then they'll want to take action. It can cause them to take action. Now, some people talk about these as the Twitter revolution or the Facebook revolution. Other people have said, no, that's not the case. Particularly, I've heard this from people who were on the ground in North Africa, and they said, actually, you have to have people actually show up. You can't just rely on media. You can't rely on your mobile phone. There's got to be somebody in the streets who's actually dealing with the police, in some cases getting beaten or clobbered or arrested. What's your perspective about that?
Sure. I mean, in Egypt today, they talk about the revolution of the couch. And these are the people who really aren't getting out in the street, who aren't really getting involved. And it's not enough to just stay there and click like on Facebook. You really do have to get out and meet. But what we're seeing is social media techniques that translate very quickly into action. One of the powerful techniques that's being used by the Occupy movement are what are called flash mobs. And these are communicated via Twitter. There are surprise events that take place in places like Times Square. The action I was on with thousands of people took over Times Square was organized strictly by Twitter. It was a flash mob event that was really a surprise. So we are seeing that it can translate immediately into action.
And here you're seeing footage from New York. This is footage that you shot on Wall Street, but people are wearing the Egyptian flag. And so people are making a direct connection between the people power in Egypt and the people power in the streets of New York City.
That's Asma Mahfouz right there. She actually came to Egypt, came to Wall Street. So it was really quite amazing to have her, the Egyptian revolution, come to the American revolution, the new American revolution, and give us advice and inspiration. I mean, this is an incredible moment in history, actually, that we were marching on Wall Street, led by this 26-year-old Egyptian revolutionary. What a moment that was.
Well, and it's not a story that was widely reported. I don't recall seeing that covered on any major news outlet, though it does seem like a story that would be a human interest angle, if nothing else. Why do you think the media didn't cover it?
Well, I think that it's much easier to look for people fighting for freedom on some other country far away. Maybe it's a little embarrassing to admit that we're actually in this continent are actually losing freedom left, right, and center. We basically have a corporatocracy. It's the amount of lobbying that's going on, the control of the government through big dollars is actually absurd. So, I think that's a challenging thing to look in the face.
Right, and there's a widespread pessimism. You don't need to be a member of the Tea Party or Occupy movement to feel pessimistic about the way Washington works these days. I think it's kind of a widespread view. You heard in many quarters. People say, gee, Washington's crony politics, both parties are almost indistinguishable. It's all about lobbyists and who can put money in the pocket of a politician. That may not be different. That may be how it's historically always been. But my interpretation of this process, this Occupy process, we talked about this on the show a few months back, is that these are people who are bypassing the normal political process because their perception is the normal political process isn't set up to serve them. And so they're going to go outside those channels and they're going to bring their message to the street in a way that it's going to be heard. But big media didn't want to cover that story. It seems that they felt like that was a story that didn't fit with their narrative that they'd constructed. It took quite a lot. Now, you pointed out that the trigger event was actually the arrests, right? And there was that big day when they marched on the Brooklyn Bridge. They were directed to do so by the New York police, who then kettled them. They cordoned them off on the bridge and arrested 700 or more protesters. Were you there that day?
No, I wasn't actually. I was filming a climate change thing in town that day. That was definitely a trigger moment. Also, the pepper spray incident was huge when these girls got pepper sprayed. Yeah. I think the strongest moments that happened in Wall Street were the nonviolent moments, and it really is at its heart a nonviolent movement. And you have that contrast when you see these kinds of injustice. It's kind of an overreaction on the part of the police. then it becomes a really powerful image. This also happened in Spain with the Indignado movement. A very similar pattern unfolded and also in Egypt and other places where there was an intense clampdown, which then was followed by an enormous popular support. And I think it's really key that movements remain nonviolent, remain rooted in those Gandhian principles, the principles of Martin Luther King. And that's a very important aspect of the film that we're developing.
Okay, cool. And so that explains the love part of the title of the film, Occupy Love. That makes sense. You know, in contrast to this movement and to that peaceful approach, there has been a kind of creeping militarism in police forces, not just in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, in response to the terrorism threat. In some respects, it's almost as if the terrorism threat's being used, leveraged, to militarize the police. And by that I mean the police tend to respond in a hyper-aggressive format. We've seen this many times in the last few years, where police come down a little bit too strong on people. One subject of police aggression has been people who are videotaping police on public streets in the daytime, using perhaps their cell phones to do so. Many states, 11 U.S. states, passed a law that made that activity illegal. It was illegal to use a video camera to videotape a public servant on a public street doing his job. That action became illegal, and they were using wiretapping laws that were passed in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. So laws that were ostensibly for Homeland Security were now being distorted to stifle citizen dissent against a government, maybe an over-aggressive police response. Some would call it perhaps a brutal police response. Did you witness any of that while you were involved in the Occupy movement?
Oh, certainly. I've seen it, in many places. Now, my focus is not actually on the confrontation, because the confrontation is really what the media picks up on. Yeah. It's sexy, it's dramatic, and yet it's actually a very small percentage of what's going on within this movement. I think it's really important to understand this movement as a cultural phenomena. It's in its infancy, it's evolving, but it's began with the voice of a new generation that's coming up. They call themselves the solution generation. They want to figure this mess out. And it's also different. It's kind of, haven't seen anything like this since the 60s, but it's also different in that it doesn't care if you're hip or square. It's very, very inclusive, so it also spans the generations at the same time. So and it's very process oriented. It's not a product. And this is something that media has a hard time getting their head around. But people who are versed in cyberspace, who understand social media, probably can get a better idea about how this is actually functioning as a kind of organizing force, self-organizing force.
I think that's a good point. And one of the big things that occurred, one of the big activities that occurred on a daily basis at the Occupy movements was education. Every Occupy movement had a library of free books that could be loaned out, and every afternoon or every morning there'd be education sessions. I was quite impressed by that when I visited the Occupy movement in Los Angeles for the brief time that they were downtown. That it was first well organized and very clean and tidy, in my opinion, and they had kind of a schedule of activities and teach-ins and so forth. I thought that was kind of a cool thing to do. It seemed to me that was where most of the day-to-day energy was going, was to educate people, to build some solidarity, to get people familiar with issues. What's funny to me is that story, again, was rarely picked up by the mainstream press. You're right. I mean, the news in the U.S. thrives on conflict, and they're always looking for that because those kinds of pictures are what make good news stories. But it seems that there's a texture to this movement that was not widely reported on. What progress do you think was made? What do you think the results of the Occupy movement were?
I think the biggest result is that it's been a shift in the conversation. We are now seeing, even in presidential addresses, a need to talk about the gross inequality of wealth that's happening in this country right now, which is not good for anybody. I mean, it's what's causing economies to collapse all over the world. Even the 1% isn't going to benefit from a system that is totally unsustainable. So we're really seeing a whole conversation emerge, and that in itself is an enormous accomplishment, because before Occupy Wall Street, that wasn't in the mainstream discourse at all. Wow. Now you can't get away without addressing it.
Very cool. Now, the movement itself kind of metastasized very quickly. We had, here, I'll pull up a graphic. So this popped up just a few weeks after the New York, after the New York event happened, the New York Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street happened. You started to see Occupy movements pop up all across the United States, North and South America, and other parts of the world. But those all got rounded up and rolled up, and in the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months, I should say, they've been systematically shut down, and in some cases in a pretty harsh way. In some cases not. The police were, kind, and they were trying their best not to be rough on people. It depends on the city. We saw some really nasty conflicts up in Oakland, for instance. Tell me about that process of shutting these organizations down, moving them off of the public lands that they were on.
Sure. It's not a good thing that happened, but really, it's really important to understand you can't evict an idea. This is a cultural phenomena, and it's not located in one geographical position. The Occupy movement has just changed form. It's not gone away, and because it's self-organizing, it's a naturally arising phenomena. So this spring, it may go back to an encampment phase. It may not. We're seeing things like in Occupy the subway, where people show up and do actions on the subway. We're seeing flash mobs. The working groups are happening. We're seeing it moving into neighborhoods, which is really important. All over the place, we're going into Occupy Harlem, Occupy Brooklyn. In Spain, it's months ahead of us there. The same movement. This is a global movement, and it's really solid in the communities where it's addressing local problems in real time. So we're seeing it as a self-organizing force, which is saying we're not waiting around anymore for permission. We're not waiting around for you to fix things. We're going to start figuring this out ourselves. So don't buy into anything that says it's gone away, because it hasn't. It's just changed shape.
One of the things I'd like to talk to you about is the use of social media to sustain this movement, even as the actual movement on the ground may have been swept aside or disappeared for a time. The people stay in touch using social media. One of the most powerful and eloquent uses of social media was the We Are the 99% blog on Tumblr. And these were very concise statements, simply photographs of people holding up a little sign, just a few words that told the story of their family. And many of those stories talked about the loss of a job, the loss of a home, the loss of insurance. Typically it involved one or two of those factors. And those are enough to tilt a family that's previously living a nice life, perhaps a middle-class life, tip them into poverty and homelessness. And that was a very eloquent use, I think, of social media, because it was simple, it was short, it was heartfelt, it was vulnerable and honest.
Yeah.
How else are they using social media?
Sure. Well, one of the moving things about this movement in general is that it's not really a bunch of activists. At its heart, it's just regular people. Many of them that I met, maybe even most of them, had never been to anything like this before.
Right. Sure.
Because of the state of the economy, because of the number of people who are losing homes or losing jobs, people are looking for some way to come together, and try to figure out what to do next. So the movement has provided this place, and it's very empowering for people to be heard, to have their stories heard. As a documentary filmmaker, I know the power of listening to people's stories and sharing them. So social media has allowed people to have that conversation, and the Occupy movement has kind of created a container for it.
That's cool.
And it's been really, really powerful.
But if it's just conversation and it doesn't translate into political action, then the movement could be described as a failure. And so far, we haven't seen any significant political results from this. Now, there's an election coming, and so if the pressure continues, if the movement resurfaces, then it probably will appear on the agenda. And as you pointed out, it did shift the conversation. We certainly have at least one party that's dead set against anything that's coming from this movement. Tell me what your take on the political cycle coming up this year will be.
Well, it's interesting because the Occupy movement per se is disgusted with party politics. Okay, I think there's a sense of this is not about left versus right anymore. This is about up top versus bottom, and this is creating a shift. So really, one of the reasons the media has a hard time understanding the lack of a one demand is because the real demand is a complete paradigm shift. So the movement is actually looking to transform society, and it's a big ticket to do that, and yet we have seen transformations happen from a small number of people that become a tipping point. So how do we actually fix the broken system? It's going to take a long time, because there's really no candidates out there that aren't in the pockets of the corporations. It's really going to be a problem. However, I think that it is there. We'll see what happens with the election, but I don't know that Mitt Romney, for example, owned a company that was practicing vulture capitalism. Right. I don't think that would have been such a news story if it wasn't for Occupy.
I think you're probably right about that. The people are now paying more attention to money and politics, and politicians with money. Those things have become kind of an issue, and in some ways, tar is a candidate, in the eyes at least of some voters.
Yeah.
Now, if many critics said that the Occupy movement was a failure because they never articulated a platform, or they never articulated.
Just a sec. You can't say it was. This thing's just beginning. This is what people don't understand. It's just beginning. It's only 4 months old. Look at the campaign against the Vietnam War. That went on for years. Look at the civil rights movement. That went on for years.
Do you think it's going to sustain? So you're very optimistic it's going to sustain.
Oh yeah, it's just starting. It's just
cool.
starting.
And and are you in touch with the people who are involved in that movement still at this point? Are they still gathering? Are they still
the millions of people all over the world? Yes, certainly.
Okay.
I'm very in touch. Yeah.
Okay, right on. Okay, that's cool. That's interesting to hear about.
I think that's really important to get your head around this. It's not something that was, one action, one specific camp or something like that. It's not about 1,000 people camping in Zuccotti Park. It's much bigger than that, and it's going to change form. But it's radical. This has radicalized a generation, and we haven't seen that since 9/11, not since an anti-globalization movement, right? Because post 9/11, there was this extreme squashing of all forms of activism. Everyone who did anything to call out corruption was called a domestic terrorist, right?
Right. So that's true. Yeah. I see your point.
Shifting. And interestingly, 7 days after the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, we see Occupy kind of flower into the world. So,
well, it's true. Many conversations I had with people here, even people who are more or less liberals or more oriented towards the liberal philosophy, they were outraged. There was a sense of outrage. Why are these people out there? Why are they doing this? Why are they demonstrating? And I thought, these are our rights, and you don't get to keep rights if you don't exercise the rights. We have the right to free speech. We have the right to peaceful assembly. But there was a general perception that somehow this was against the law. Were there laws broken or not?
Let's talk about the public comments. We need to actually reclaim the public comments. Margaret Thatcher famously said there are no more communities, there were only families. That's the ultimate extent of the sort of neoliberal agenda, is to really destroy and undermine communities, so we're all just consumers. I think what we're talking about in re-inhabiting these public spaces, turning them into what in ancient Greek was called the agora, we're creating this real democracy where people are finally engaging again. They're participating. This is participatory democracy. Our government should be excited about this. Let's get off of the couch. Let's start engaging. Let's solution build here, because we're in trouble. We're in trouble economically. We're in trouble ecologically. We had, what did we have in the past years? We had the slacker generation. How exciting was that? Now we've got the solution generation. Let's celebrate this.
Right on. No, it's true. A higher level of political engagement is good for all. I believe you're right. And more ideas on the table is also a welcome phenomenon. So your view then is that this movement's going to rely on social media and user-generated or consumer-generated video in order to sustain themselves, to stay in touch, to communicate tactics and planning, and also to get the message out, because they really have disappeared from the national narrative that happens in mainstream media. It's almost as if the movement's been brushed aside. It got shut down, the police came in, they rolled up the camps, they put down new turf, and so much for that. It's over.
That would be a narrative. That would be a narrative that the mainstream media would be strongly invested in promoting.
Right. Okay. It's an interesting take. Now, tell me about your film and tell me about what the trajectory is for that film. Will it be done anytime soon? Are you going to release it in time for the political, for the presidential campaign, the presidential election?
We're hoping to have it released by the fall of 2012. So yeah, it could be out in time for that. And of course, we're very active in social media ourselves. We release YouTube videos regularly. One of our recent videos has had over a couple 100,000 views.
What's the YouTube? What's the URL for your clips? Where can we best find those clips?
OccupyLove.org.
OccupyLove.org. Okay, great.
Yeah. And we're doing a project right now called Occupy Valentine's Day, and that's going to be a user-generated, there's an app, a group called Studio Occupy have created an app which allows people to easily upload video clips, and we want to hear what your Occupy Love story is, and how do you occupy love? What does that mean to you?
Cool. So you're really putting into practice what you were talking about a minute ago, where it's a focus on the positive. This is not about conflict. This is not about some sort of protest. Instead, it's about let's craft a positive vision and share that idea. So that's great. You're kind of putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
Sure. It's important to be about what you are for as what you are against. You also do need to stand up for what's unjust. Cornel West said justice is love made public, right? And that's what we're really working for, is a just world, a compassionate world. I don't think that's too much to ask for.
Right on, cool. And as we see these final clips here, these are more clips from the film by Velcrow Ripper, who's been my guest today. I'm going to encourage everybody to go check out OccupyLove.org, where you can find out more about his documentary film that covers this interesting new political phenomenon, the leaderless, self-organizing, spontaneous group or network, sometimes dubbed a mob, and then, frankly, sometimes we've seen it devolve into that. He's going to talk about all those nuances and more in his film, which we will hope to see in theaters this fall in time for the presidential election, and thereby put that issue and their demands on the political agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about next week's show. We're going to have a great guest back in the studio, Michael Margolis. He'll be here to talk about education, big changes in education, the opening up of education, free education, social media, and education. And I encourage you all to tune back in for that. That's been an area of tremendous progress in the last few months, and there's some great news happening. I want to thank Velcrow Ripper for being my guest on the show today. I'm Robert Tercek, and as always, we love to hear your comments. We love to get your emails, so please definitely contact us at TWI Social Media. That's our Twitter handle, and of course our email, TWISocialmedia@thisweekend.com. Thank you all very much. Over and out. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.